Central banks are commonly described as neutral institutions, technical bodies, independent from politics, focused solely on stability. This description feels reassuring. It suggests that monetary decisions are insulated from power, interest, and pressure. Historically and structurally, this assumption does not hold. Central banks are not neutral observers operating outside the system. They are institutions designed to shape outcomes while appearing detached from them. Neutrality in this context is not the absence of influence. It is a form of influence exercised indirectly. The idea of independence plays a central role here. Independence is often treated as a moral property, something a central bank either has or does not have. In reality, it is an institutional arrangement created for a specific purpose. That purpose is not to remove power from monetary policy. It is to relocate it. Historically, central banks were not independent by default. They emerged as instruments of states, often closely tied to fiscal needs, war financing, and debt management. Independence became prominent only when systems reached a point where direct political control over money created instability. Short-term incentives conflicted with long-term system management. The solution was not to depoliticize money. It was to buffer it. By placing monetary authority at a distance from electoral pressure, systems reduced volatility in decision-making. But this distance also reduced visibility and direct accountability. This trade-off is essential. Independence does not eliminate responsibility. It redistributes it. When outcomes are favorable, central banks are credited with technical competence. When outcomes are unfavorable, responsibility becomes diffuse. Inflation can be framed as external, crises as systemic, decisions as necessary. This structure is not accidental. Modern economies rely heavily on expectations. Confidence and stability, credibility of institutions, and predictability of response matter more than individual actions. Central banks operate primarily in this expectation space. Their statements, projections, and signals often have greater impact than their balance sheets. Neutrality in this sense is performative. The institution must appear above conflict to anchor belief. Not because it is detached from power, but because the system requires a stable reference point. This is why central banks communicate carefully, why their language is technical, why their mandates are narrow in wording but broad in effect. Distance creates authority. Complexity creates insulation. The more abstract the institution appears, the less directly it can be challenged. This does not mean central banks act maliciously or with hidden intent. It means they operate within a design that prioritizes system stability over transparency. Neutrality is not a natural state. It is a function the system assigns. And like all functions in complex systems, it serves a purpose. Understanding that purpose is the first step toward understanding how monetary power actually works. The independence of central banks is often treated as a natural evolution, as if monetary institutions simply matured beyond political influence. Historically, this is inaccurate. For most of their existence, central banks operated as explicit extensions of state power. They financed wars. They stabilized government debt. They coordinated fiscal needs. Their objectives were openly political, even when framed as technical. Independence did not emerge because systems discovered neutrality. It emerged because direct control became destabilizing. As democratic systems expanded, so did short-term political incentives. Election cycles favored immediate relief over long-term balance. Monetary policy became a convenient tool. This created a structural conflict. Governments needed flexibility. But frequent intervention undermined credibility, fueled volatility, and destabilized expectations. The solution was not to remove power from money. It was to redesign how that power was exercised. Independence, in this context, is best understood as insulation. By separating monetary authority from direct political control, systems reduced the frequency of intervention. Decisions became slower, more deliberate, and less reactive. But insulation has a cost. As authority moves further from elected structures, accountability weakens. Decisions gain durability but lose immediacy. This trade-off is intentional. Central banks are granted narrow mandates: price stability, employment targets, financial stability, but broad discretion in how those mandates are interpreted. This combination is powerful. A narrow mandate simplifies communication. Broad discretion preserves flexibility. Responsibility becomes procedural rather than personal. Independence also alters how failure is defined. When monetary policy is politically controlled, outcomes are attributed directly. Inflation becomes a government failure. Instability becomes a political cost. Under independence, outcomes are reframed. Inflation can be described as external, market stress as systemic, policy choices as constrained. Responsibility becomes diffuse. This diffusion is not accidental. It stabilizes the system. By reducing the visibility of causality, systems reduce pressure for abrupt change. Central banks are not expected to be popular. They are expected to be credible. Credibility, in turn, depends less on outcomes and more on consistency. Consistency requires insulation from immediate reaction. This is why independence persists even when it produces unequal or contested effects. From a structural perspective, independence is not about neutrality. It is about time. It allows monetary decisions to operate on a different temporal horizon than politics. Politics responds to cycles measured in years. Monetary systems manage obligations measured in decades. Aligning these timelines directly would create instability. Independence decouples them. Seen this way, independence is not a claim about objectivity. It is a design solution to a coordination problem. The system does not ask central banks to be neutral. It asks them to be predictable. Neutrality is the appearance that supports that predictability. And once that appearance is accepted, the institution gains authority that no openly political body could sustain. In public perception, central banks are often associated with concrete tools: interest rates, balance sheets, liquidity operations. These instruments matter, but structurally they are secondary. The primary domain in which central banks operate is expectations. Modern economic systems are highly forward-looking. Investment decisions, pricing, borrowing, and wage negotiations depend less on current conditions than on anticipated ones. Central banks understand this. Their effectiveness depends not on how much money they create, but on how believable their control appears to be. This is why communication occupies such a central role. Statements, projections, press conferences, and guidance are not peripheral. They are core policy tools. Forward guidance illustrates this clearly. By signaling future intentions, central banks shape present behavior. Markets adjust before any action occurs. Borrowing costs move. Asset prices react. In many cases, the announcement is sufficient. The intervention never needs to be fully executed. This dynamic explains why credibility is so carefully protected. If expectations are anchored, the system remains stable with minimal intervention. If credibility weakens, increasingly aggressive actions are required. Neutrality plays a functional role here. An institution perceived as political would struggle to anchor expectations. Its signals would be interpreted through the lens of interest and conflict. By presenting itself as technical and independent, the central bank frames its guidance as informational rather than strategic. This framing is powerful. It converts opinion into expectation, and expectation into behavior. Importantly, expectation management is asymmetric. Markets react more strongly to perceived loss of control than to evidence of control. This is why central banks often prioritize signaling stability even when uncertainty is high. They must project confidence. Doubt spreads faster than reassurance. Unanchored expectations create volatility. Volatility forces action. From a system perspective, managing belief is cheaper than managing outcomes. This creates a subtle but significant form of power. Central banks influence behavior not by commanding it, but by shaping what actors consider likely. This influence is not neutral. Different groups experience its effects unevenly. Asset holders respond quickly to signals. Wage earners adjust slowly. Borrowers and savers experience opposite pressures. Yet the process itself remains framed as technical. Outcomes are described as market responses. Distributional effects are treated as secondary. This framing protects the institution. If the central bank were openly political, these asymmetries would be contested directly. Neutrality reduces that pressure. It transforms political consequences into technical side effects. Expectation management also explains why central banks resist transparency beyond a certain point. Too much detail invites interpretation. Interpretation invites disagreement. Disagreement undermines anchoring. Instead, communication is calibrated, clear enough to guide behavior, abstract enough to avoid challenge. This balance is not accidental. It is learned. Over time, central banks refine not just their tools, but their language. What appears neutral is often carefully constructed, not to deceive, but to stabilize. In this sense, central banks operate less like neutral referees and more like narrative anchors. They define the frame within which economic behavior occurs. That frame shapes outcomes long before policy is enacted. Neutrality here is not an absence of influence. It is the condition that makes influence effective. Independence and expectation management share a common requirement: distance. Distance from voters. Distance from electoral cycles. Distance from direct accountability. This distance is often described as objectivity. In practice, it functions as power. The further an institution is from immediate consequences, the more freely it can operate within long-term constraints. Central banks are designed to exist in this space. They do not compete for legitimacy through elections. They do not require popular approval. Their authority is procedural, not representative. This insulation allows them to absorb pressure without responding to it directly. Distance also reshapes responsibility. When outcomes are positive, success is attributed to sound policy. When outcomes are negative, causality becomes diffuse. Inflation can be blamed on supply shocks, asset bubbles on market exuberance, inequality on structural forces. The institution remains intact. This asymmetry is not a flaw. It is a stabilizing feature. Systems that concentrate responsibility too tightly become fragile. Public backlash accelerates intervention. Policy oscillates. Distance dampens this cycle. By placing decision-making behind layers of expertise and procedure, systems slow down reaction speed. Slower reaction means fewer abrupt reversals. Fewer reversals mean greater predictability. Predictability is more valuable to modern financial systems than precision. This is why central bank independence is rarely reversed, even during crises. Crises increase pressure. Pressure increases demands for control. Yet independence persists. Because removing distance would transfer instability directly into the political sphere. Governments would inherit not only authority but volatility. Central banks act as buffers. They absorb shocks that would otherwise destabilize political systems. This buffering role explains why they are often criticized yet rarely restructured. Their value lies precisely in their unpopularity. Distance also affects how power is perceived. Decisions framed as technical appear inevitable. They seem constrained by models, mandates, and data. Political decisions invite debate. Technical decisions invite compliance. This distinction shapes public response. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Distance enables authority. Authority reinforces credibility. Credibility strengthens expectations. The institution becomes self-stabilizing. This does not mean central banks are neutral. It means their influence operates through structure rather than instruction. They do not dictate behavior directly. They shape the environment in which behavior occurs. Markets adjust. Governments adapt. Households respond. All within a frame defined elsewhere. Understanding this frame is essential. Without it, debates about independence become superficial. They focus on intent rather than function. Central banks are not independent because they are apolitical. They are independent because systems require a space where decisions can be made without immediate reversal. Distance is not an ethical claim. It is an operational necessity. The question, then, is not whether central banks should be neutral. The question is whether modern systems could remain stable without institutions designed to operate beyond direct accountability. That question leads directly to the conclusion. When examined structurally, the idea of central bank neutrality changes meaning. Neutrality is not an absence of power. It is a way power is exercised. Central banks are not positioned outside the system. They are embedded within it, designed to perform a specific stabilizing role. Independence does not remove influence from monetary policy. It relocates it. Expectations do not emerge spontaneously. They are anchored. Distance does not eliminate responsibility. It redistributes it. Together, these elements form an institutional design optimized for system preservation. Central banks operate where political systems cannot. They absorb volatility that would otherwise destabilize governance. They manage long-term constraints that electoral cycles cannot accommodate. This is why their authority is procedural rather than representative. Why their language is technical rather than moral. Why their mandates appear narrow while their impact is broad. None of this requires bad intent. The system does not need central banks to be deceptive. It needs them to be credible. Credibility depends on consistency. Consistency requires insulation. Insulation creates distance. That distance is often mistaken for objectivity. In reality, it is a form of institutional power. Not power exercised through commands, but through structure. Not through visibility, but through framing. By defining the boundaries of acceptable outcomes, central banks shape behavior without direct intervention. Markets respond. Governments adapt. Households adjust. All within a system that treats these outcomes as technical necessities rather than political choices. This is why debates about central bank independence often stall. They focus on intent instead of function, on neutrality instead of design. But neutrality is not a property of institutions. It is a role assigned by the system, and that role exists for a reason. Modern economies rely on debt, expectations, and long-term coordination. They require mechanisms that can operate beyond immediate accountability. Central banks fulfill that requirement, not because they are neutral, but because they are structured to appear neutral. Understanding this does not resolve the tension surrounding monetary authority, but it clarifies it. Central banks are not anomalies within modern systems. They are products of them. And as long as stability depends on managed expectations and delayed accountability, institutions designed around distance will remain central.